I've become increasingly convinced that defence policy is going to dominate the next 10 or 20 years of our politics in a way that it certainly hasn't over the last 20. When I was a teenager and in my 20s, defence policy was a really important thing. And we had the Falklands War, we had the Cold War. And ever since the end of the Cold War, I think we've kind of taken our eye off the ball, and we almost see defence spending as a bit of a luxury. Well, no longer, because 2 years ago, in 2 days' time, that's the anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it's something that I think many of us thought we would hopefully never see in our lifetime, a European country invading another European country with all sorts of consequences, not just in defence terms, but also in economic terms too, because we all know that one of the main reasons that our fuel bills have gone through the roof is because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So attention is starting to shift now to, well, what should we be doing over the next 10 or 20 years to not just protect our country, but also protect all the other members of NATO. Because although Vladimir Putin maintains that he would never, ever even think about invading Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Finland, Sweden, people in those countries don't believe a word of it. They're all members of NATO. Sweden and Finland joined NATO in the last 18 months or so. And they clearly fear that Russia has ill intentions towards them. Now, I hope those fears are ill-founded. But instead of spending what we've been spending on defence, I suspect defence spending has got to increase dramatically. But is that something that voters are going to really buy into? I want to hear from you over the next hour on all of those issues. 0345 6060 973. That's the number to call. Well, Peter, welcome to the programme. Tell us why you wanted to write about the history of NATO, because people say, it's a bit of a dry subject to write about.
Well, I mean, firstly, it was a really good prism to look at how we got from 1945 to the present. So, the idea came after the invasion of Ukraine, as you say, the return of proper old-fashioned, massed firepower, massed population warfare in Europe. And the story of NATO, really is the story of how we avoided that during the Cold War. The creation of NATO between 1945 and 1949 really was the story of tying together Europe and the United States, ending American isolationism, then building up those kind of defences. You talked about those tough choices about defence spending. Dwight D. Eisenhower was NATO's first Supreme Allied Commander from 1951, 1952. And he really wrestled with that issue because he realised quite early on that we could do what the Soviets did. We could put a huge chunk of our GDP into defence over a 25, 30, 40-year period, but then we wouldn't be able to rebuild. And striking that balance between rebuilding Europe in the way we did from 1945 through to the 70s, 80s, 90s, and having enough defence, both nuclear and conventional, was really something that we struggled with throughout the Cold War. Cold War ended, that vanished. Balkans, Afghanistan, and then you're on an express elevator ride back to the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So it's a doorstep of a book, but the chapters are quite short, and there's a lot of history crammed into it.
So it's very, very readable. And I suppose my first encounter with NATO, if I can call it that, was when I used to do debates in the 1980s on why NATO was right and CND were wrong. And it's developed as an organisation in a very sort of different way since then, hasn't it? It's still got the same objectives, but the threats are different.
Well, I mean, it depends on when you compare things too, because actually if you sit in Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe today in Mons, or you're in Estonia today, and I was there just last week, it feels pretty like Europe in 1951. You've got a very large rearming Russian/Soviet state that has clearly got ambitions towards its neighbours. You've got a very real possibility of conflict, and you've got rising tensions. If you think back to the early 1950s, you had those sort of 11 years of rising tensions, 12 years through the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and we really are back in that kind of environment now. But yes, that feels hugely different to when I was first a reservist around 1999, 2001, where we thought conflict was something that happened in dusty places half a world away. We're a very long way away from where we were even a decade ago when it comes to NATO. So it's going back to its roots. But of course, there's pretty much no one alive these days who remembers those roots.
If we look at the situation in Europe at the moment, and there's a clear and obvious threat from Russia, I remember 2 years ago, literally the week before Putin invaded, talking to Mary Dejevsky, who had been Moscow correspondent for The Independent, and she was absolutely adamant that Putin wouldn't, he's not stupid, he wouldn't do that. And that seemed to be the consensus among most defence so-called experts, and they were all proved completely wrong. And I mean, I can remember back in November 2021, looking at all the sort of the reports of the troop movements and the fact that they were building sort of hospitals sort of on the border, and you think, well, they wouldn't do that for an exercise, would they? And I came to the conclusion way before that that Putin did intend to invade, and I'm thinking, well, I'm not a defence expert. I like to think I know a little bit, but I'm not an expert. Why did all the experts get that wrong?
Well, I think to be fair to those who questioned the invasion, I think there were two separate things going on that are quite understandable with hindsight. The first is that Zelensky in Ukraine was talking down the prospect of invasion right up until the very last minute. And there were a variety of quite good reasons for doing that, not least to try and keep the Ukrainian economy afloat, trying to stop sort of mass flight of capital and other things. He'd actually been told, we know with hindsight, that that by the Americans that invasion was likely several months earlier. But I think you can understand why he wasn't talking that up. And the second is Iraq. So there was, in the North Atlantic Council, there was a very considerable constituency of opinion, voiced particularly vocally by the French, but also other people, that, the Americans have got this very badly wrong before, and that they might therefore have got it wrong again. And the simple truth is that I think quite a few people thought that Putin was bluffed to the limit and then pulled back. And it was only in the last sort of week or so that people really realised that, that really wasn't going to happen, and we really were going over the edge.
So let's try and look to the future a little bit, because I do want to get people on the air to ask you some questions. We've already got several phoning in. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to talk to Peter. Do you agree with me that we're going to have a really big, intensive debate about our defence policy, and in the end, it's going to, whatever we decide, we're going to have to spend a lot more money on it?
Yeah, so I think there's two things going on here. Firstly, there's the West is going to have a serious discussion about defence. NATO is going to have a serious discussion about defence. What the Americans do, we've talked about Trump a bit already, is going to be hugely important. And then the question is what role Britain wishes to play in that. To what extent do we wish to prioritise the defence of Europe? Traditionally, over the last 20, 30 years, we've tried to do bits of stuff all over the world. We don't necessarily treat NATO as our core task, which is one of them. You still hear people, defence ministers, chief defence staff talking about sending a submarine to Taiwan, doing stuff in the Middle East. How important is Europe in that greater scale of things? The Americans have quite a strong opinion on that. They think we should do more in Europe. How much do we want to follow European powers who maybe are thinking of reintroducing conscription? How do we want to engage with Europe? And of course, what does Europe look like? Because that will depend on what we've got to engage with.
How live a debate is that in other European countries about conscription? Because, I can just imagine Grant Shapps standing up at the dispatch box and announcing that in this country. There would almost be a revolution, wouldn't there?
Yeah, so in the Baltic states, it's a done deal. In the Nordic states that have got to have a tradition of this, it's coming back. The Poles, interestingly enough, it's surprisingly unpopular in Poland. The Poles are really struggling with what they do about conscription. It's a much liver debate in Germany. Elsewhere, it's quite unpopular. But
Germany had conscription until comparatively recently.
Germany did, as did France. The other thing that's really interesting, one of the think tanks called the Friends of Europe in Brussels did some really good focus groups with young Europeans. And young Europeans, by and large, are a lot more open to being conscripted by the European Union than they are by their respective countries. Now, that's a very different Europe to the one we thought we were engaging with. And that obviously would put Britain, there's a whole bunch of questions about how Britain could engage with that. And I don't think, intellectually or otherwise, we've really started to mention that. The nuclear deterrent is the other point. The French have a nuclear deterrent, we have a nuclear deterrent. They are, between them, the two nuclear deterrents in Europe. Would the EU want to get its own nuclear deterrent to be the French? How would we interact? There's a whole bunch of really quite interesting conversations. And I don't, to be honest, think that we have quite really begun to engage with what those questions would be. So yes, probably spending more on defence, but how you do that is really a bunch of really live questions.
Because it's quite difficult to persuade people who think the NHS is underfunded, that education is underfunded, that the police are underfunded, that money should be taken from those budgets to put into defence. Yeah,
and to an extent, if your society collapses at one end, you don't have effective defence. It all comes out of the same pot. There's a reason why the Labour government that built NATO in 1945 also built the welfare state. Right, that was a whole part of building a social contract after the Second World War. It was a whole part of building that social contract that kept communism out. So these are really quite complicated questions.
One of the other things that people say, and they say it often on this programme, that NATO is not a defensive alliance. Do you address that in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it really depends where you're coming from, right? So, the Estonians, in particular, Kaja Kallas, their prime minister, is pretty upfront and borderline sort of in undiplomatic in that invading countries is bad and NATO should exist to stop it. Now, that is an implicit criticism of the invasion of Iraq in 2004. Now, ironically, the Baltic states got into NATO because they did a deal with the Bush administration to support the invasion of Iraq. But I think there is an opinion, it's certainly in the areas where people can imagine themselves being invaded, that invasions are a bad idea and they should be stopped. You're right. I mean, in Kosovo and Libya, there's no question that NATO intervened. It also intervened in Bosnia, but in Bosnia it did so as a subcontractor for the UN, which is unquestionably fine under the UN Charter. The other two were a lot dodgier. The intervention in Afghanistan is different because NATO came in after the 5 years after the Taliban were toppled. But again, George Robertson, former Secretary General, admitted it wasn't their finest hour. A very long-running campaign that obviously ended in complete disaster. So yeah, I mean, there's the NATO that fundamentally I tell the story of is the one that defends Europe. But yes, there's quite a lot of bits in it where it goes off and does other things, and by and large, those are not always as successful.